Welcome. I'm Barry Danylak, and this is a summary See Global webinar, How the Sexual Revolution Changed Everything and How to Constructively Respond. And this is a summary of a longer See Global webinar that we have by the same name. And so I would like to just begin by giving an overview of the sexual revolution, how we got here. And what we're going to look at really is the intellectual history that really got us to the point of the last 50 years where we've really seen, or 60 years, where we've really seen the fruit of the sexual revolution in its various forms. And so, and I'm going to lean heavily here on a very helpful book in terms of sketching this out by Carl Trueman, called The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self. And I'm just going to kind of outline a few of the key figures that Trueman brings up. First, René Descartes, the philosophical self. Descartes really is a watershed figure in philosophical history, in moving the focus of philosophical discussion from metaphysics to the realm of epistemology. That is the sense of how we come to know things. And of course, Descartes' famous statement, "I doubt, therefore I am," focus really was on proving the existence of the self. It's not about what's out there, but it's about what's inside. How do I prove that I exist? And really piggybacking on sort of the philosophical idea was Jean-Jacques Rousseau. And of course, he was a prolific writer and is known for his confessions along the line of Saint Augustine. Rousseau really moves things to the psychological self, this idea that who we are is what is within. And it's not determined so much about what's without in the body, but really the true man or woman, the true self, is that which is within. Rousseau argued what is within is inherently good, and it's been unfortunately corrupted by external social influences. In other words, all human beings start out good. Savage human being, he called the noble savage, is really the essence of pure humanity. And it is good, and who we are is good, but we get corrupted along the way by outside forces that try to control us, that socialize us, that the institutions of government and our society that necessitate us playing well with others and getting on with others around us. And so he really moves the discussion to this idea that the inner self is the pure self and the uncorrupted self. Darwin, of course, moves to this idea of the physical self being ultimately something that has evolved. And in his theory of evolution, of course, he eliminates the need for God. And if you think about natural selection for Darwin, this is what ultimately is sort of what seems to create and new life forms as they progress. And of course, the pinnacle of natural selection is sex. Now, this is rather important if we think about it, because sex now becomes the essence of the physical being. And of course, this is true for Darwin, whether you're a human being, whether you're an animal, whether you're a plant. For all living beings, reproduction is really the crux of life, and reproducing one's DNA, and that is, in some sense, the pinnacle of existence. Nietzsche, of course, takes us to this idea of the death of God, the godless self, eliminating the need for God philosophically, The self then reigns supreme. Marx is significant in terms of the idea of the politics of progress. Progress is the oppressed overthrowing the oppressor, moving from more primitive social economic forms to more advanced ones. And this idea of the oppressed needing to overthrow the oppressor, and the oppressors using things like religion and rules and society to keep the oppressed under their control and to keep their dominance. Freud really moves the psychological self to the sexual self. The essence for Freud of psychological health, of course, is in the satisfaction of sexual desire. And this then for Freud really moves into the essence of what it means to be human, is sexual flourishing of the human being. And of course, for Freud, this is, we are sexual beings from childhood. So from the very essence of birth, happiness is about fulfilling our sexual desires. Society then, or the need to get on with others, means a suppression of our sexual desire in order to play well with others within society. And of course, this then really moves into kind of what is almost a full-blown form with the rise of the New Left. Wilhelm Reich, Herbert Marcuse are two particular figures. Really what they do is they simply move the Marx's discussion of economic liberation into the arena of psychological liberation. The ultimate liberation of the human being is psychological, not economic. How do we achieve ultimate psychological freedom? If we are sexual beings. So they combine Marx with Freud. Well, this necessitates complete sexual liberation. True political freedom is the ability for individuals to express their true sexual selves and beings, as Freud defines it. And of course, this really sets the stage for sexuality really being at the core of our beings and at the core of identity politics. Being that the self truly is psychological, then anything that harms us, ultimate harm, is psychological harm. Anybody that detracts from our well-being, which is of course in our sexual expression, because we are sexual beings, is therefore detrimental. And traditional religion is instruments of that oppressive control that needs to be really turned over and eliminated so that we can be the sexual beings we were intended to be, or shall we say that we have evolved to be. And now, at the heart then really is two worldviews. I like to think that the sexual revolution really speaks to the sex-centric worldview. Traditional Christians are that have a biblical foundation have foundationally a theocentric worldview. In the sex-centric worldview, our identity is really in however we see ourselves and find our pleasure relative to others. This is straight from Foucault and others, who argue that that's what our identity is, however we see ourselves and how we find pleasure. And of course, that's sexual pleasure. And therefore, our destiny is found in those very same relationships. The theocentric worldview says our identity is actually being created in the image of God, modeled after the incarnate Christ. Our destiny then is not in being fulfilled in human relationships, but is to be fulfilled in the eternal relationship found in God himself. Notice the sex-centric view focuses on self and human relationships. Core to who we are in the theocentric view is God, the image of God modeled by Christ, and our destiny itself is to be in Christ. Sometimes I think Christians have really, without knowing it, baptized in some sense a sex-centric worldview, and said that what is ultimate is in marriage and the need to be married, because this is how we express intimate human relationships. And of course, this is something we need to be thinking about, that the tendency for, without realizing it, to inadvertently kind of fall into a sex-centric worldview, rather than coming back to really the foundational biblical understanding that what makes us human is Christ. And this idea of being in the image of God, created in the image of God, fulfilled in our relationship with Christ. So to summarize, in the theocentric worldview, Scripture gives us three purposes of sex: the procreative, furthering the race; the unitive, to bind the marriage; and the typological, to point to our ultimate union with Christ. The theocentric worldview may also gives us the model of Jesus, who was fully human in every way, but celibate. And so what does this mean? Well, it demonstrates that sexual relations is not critical for fully expressing our humanity. And it's important that celibate singles also testify to this truth. When we have celibate singles within the community of the church, we reflect this model of Christ, that what is ultimate about being human is being in God's image, not that we necessarily have to be in a sexual conjugal relationship. So our identity is grounded in being created in God's image as male and female, but not necessarily in the fulfillment of sexual relations. Our identity is fulfilled ultimately not through the human sexual relationship, which often disappoints, but in experiencing the ultimate relationship of the universe, the divine human relationship that our sexual relationship as human beings actually points to. Our bodies therefore also attest to God's design for sex as something that's intended to build and bond marriage. And I just point to the natural theology there, which David Blankenhorn in his book, The Future Marriage, really, I think, highlights well. And casual sex, of course, conversely, risks harming ourselves physically, psychologically, and emotionally. So, given the contrast of worldviews, what are some strategies for response? Well, first, let me suggest that we need to really avoid the culture war rhetoric. The culture war rhetoric is really, the idea of condemning behaviors and how degraded society has become, whether it's sex outside of marriage, or if we're offended by gay marriage, or whatever it is. And really focusing instead on this idea that, hey, at stake, we have got really different worldviews. And this is a worldview battle, not an issue of particular behaviors at stake. And I'll talk more about that in just a minute. We must not succumb to the same assumptions of the sex-centric worldview. And one that Truman points to is this idea of no-fault divorce. In some sense, we have, before same-sex marriage came along, we already had been redefining marriage in the Western world, and we have to be aware that about allowing these redefinitions of marriage, which of course had less of an issue within the ripple in the Christian world than when same-sex marriage came along. Costly obedience is a, Truman points out, this is a book that was put out. It's a very good book, by the way, and there's nothing against the book. But the point of the book was that those who are same-sex attracted living celibate lives have to live costly obedience. And Truman's point is, why is same-sex individuals choosing to be celibate any more costly of obedience than any individual who keeps a commitment to sexual relations within marriage, whether they're hetero, widowed, divorced, whatever their situation is. And is that really the way we should focus? That celibacy is the most costly thing in the world, or are there more positive ways we can speak and think about singleness itself? Of course, we need a humble and loving disposition. And I would just also point out, and Truman mentions this, and I think it's an excellent point, the church needs to be intentional in being a community that teaches and models our theocentric worldview. And this includes a visible inclusion of celibate singles in the community. And I think if we're going to support those that are struggling with various types of identity issues, sexuality challenges, we need a strong sense of it's okay to be celibate within the church community, and that should be visible as well as something that we teach. In other words, we need a high view of marriage, singleness, and sexuality. Let me just talk a little bit about personal responses then, when we encounter somebody that's coming from a different point of view. I think we need to recognize that we really are, we really have a question of worldviews. If we condemn somebody because we feel what they're doing behaviorally is morally wrong, whether that's cohabitation or if they're in a same-sex relationship and we feel that's morally wrong. The problem is of course, that oftentimes it seems to be the church that's the condemning. We kind of walk into this idea that, see, in their worldview, it's the taboos of the church that is actually the oppressor. And so it's not a very constructive way to enter into dialogue. Rather, I think we need to think about the reality that we have very different worldviews about what it is to be human. And we need to recognize that worldviews change when the data of experience is better explained by alternative hypotheses. So, for example, we should use the evidence of natural theology wherever possible. And a good way to do this is to really question the assumptions of the worldview. Is it really true that the essence of humanity is about sex? Is sex really what it means to be human? Or is there something bigger than that, something more profound, something deeper, a design in which we were designed for? Or a purpose that we were designed for? Is happiness to really the result of maximizing genital pleasure, as Freud suggested? Can a single celibate live a fulfilled life? Is this possible? Now, of course, this flies right into the assumptions of a sex-centric worldview. Nobody's fulfilled unless they're expressing themselves sexually, according to Freud. But is this true? What about celibate people that live a fulfilled, contented life as celibate individuals? What do we do with that, you see? So this is ways of questioning the assumptions of the worldview. Is the real me strictly psychological? Or is it more than that? Nancy Pearcey, in her book, Love Thy Body, does an excellent job of unpacking this. The Gnostic sense of focusing only on the psychological rather than on the whole, the nature of the whole body. And that's, I think, particularly important in the area of transgender discussions. Question the outcomes of the worldview. Does a sexual relationship ultimately satisfy your deepest longings? Or do human beings often come up short? Does the sexual experience, serial, constant sexual relationships really lead to psychological satisfaction? Or do they lead to distress, soul ties, bondage, more challenges? Do they simplify your life or do they complicate your life? So are the very outcomes of the worldview, do they play out in terms of the experience of individuals? And I think we need to think about, does the data back up the claims? Many studies on all sorts of areas of sexuality. Do children really do as well with same-sex parents? Is that really backed up in the data? Do sex change operations really ultimately lead to better, improved lives over the long haul? Is the depression that's experienced really the result of outsiders not accepting them, or is the depression really coming from within? So all sorts of questions in terms of the data that's really out there in the studies. And I think studies really should be looked at and scrutinized carefully here. Finally, some strategies for political response. Here we're talking about the macro level of, what do we do for the issues of politics and government? And I would just say, and I think Truman would agree, that political battle lines are really pretty clear right now between the right of freedom of religion and the right of sexual and gender minorities not to be discriminated against. Truman, and I would tend to agree with him, believes that at the end of the day, probably the latter will win over the former. That is, because of this idea of political freedom, if religion is really seen as an oppressive agent of individual freedom and liberty, then freedom of religion, if it's not seen to be life-giving and enhancing dignity of human beings, but actually mitigating or lessening that very dignity, then of course it's going to be seen as something that doesn't ultimately enhance freedom of individuals. And so I think Christians need to anticipate that probably today's culture will give preference in this way, and we're probably not going to win this battle. Conversely, we need to know why we believe what we believe and be prepared to stand in that and to live it as the church, live out our worldview and understand the power of our worldview as Christians. I think we can, and this is a positive, I think, strategy, move to offer sound judgments for preserving the right of the individual's internal moral conscience. In other words, moving the focus of freedom of religion from freedom of outward practices and things that are often seen as oppressive, to moving toward the freedom of moral conscience. A little bit like conscientious objectors, pacifists, right, to war. Some of us just object to certain aspects of society, certain ways society lives and chooses to live. And we should have the right to our moral conscience and to live according to our moral conscience. Of course, as Christians, that moral conscience is driven by Scripture and our faith. But nevertheless, it's moral conscience, which is an internal issue of the self, over external dogmas, is probably, I think, a more profitable direction to take. And finally, extolling the right of individual liberty, and particularly in the area of conversion therapy. I think saying, it's important for the individual to have liberty over their own treatments, however they see their personhood, their sexual identity, their gender identity. We should give them the right to have access to whatever therapy support systems can enhance their well-being. Of course, this is not forcing any such support structure on anybody, but it's simply allowing the individual's right of discretion over their own treatment as they see a fit and appropriate for their lives. So these are just a few of ways of potentially responding. I thank you for joining us on this webinar, and we will catch you next time.